In this lesson, we are going to be factoring difference of squares and perfect square trinomials. Now, factoring difference of squares is basically what the name suggests. There is a difference, meaning a subtraction signs, between two squares. Now, what do I mean by squares? Squares are basically any numbers that have a square root. So let me give you an example. So 36 is a square because if you were to take the square root of 36, that would come to 6, because 6 squared is 36, so 36 is a square. Similarly, 9 is a square because if we took the square root of it, we would end up with 3. 3 squared is 9, so that makes sense. Okay, so now let's do an actual question. Suppose we have a square, which is 36x squared, and just a little reminder, square root of x squared is actually x, because x times x is x squared, so that's a square. Okay, and let's do minus 9y squared. So here is our question. Now, how would we factor it? Well, we would factor it like this. We would have two brackets, a plus and minus in one, and the square root of each square. So let's try that with our actual question right here. So we know those two are squares, and there's a difference between them. So to factor it, we would draw two brackets, put a plus and a minus in one, and then let's just take the square root of each. So square root of 36x squared is 6x. So let's put that here and in the second bracket. And then let's find the square root of 9y squared, which is just 3y. And we'll put that in the other bracket as well. And this right here is our answer. Now let's try these questions, starting with the first one. First you want to see, is this actually a difference of squares? Well, x squared is a square and 100 is a square, because you can take the square root of each. And there's a minus sign in the middle, so it is difference of squares. So to do that, we draw two brackets, and then put plus in one and minus in the other, and then we take the square root of each. So let's start with the x squared. The square root of that is just x, so we'll put that here and there. And the square root of 100 is 10, so let's put that on both brackets. And this right here is our answer. Okay, now let's do the next question. We know those two are squares with the minus sign in the middle. So to start off, we are going to draw two brackets. And then we will put plus in one and minus in the other. Now, it does not have to be in that order. You can actually put minus here and plus here, as long as the signs are different. That's all that matters. Now let's take the square root of each. Square root of 4y squared is 2y, so we'll put that on the left and also on the right. And the square root of 9 is 3, so let's put that here in both brackets. And this right here is our final answer. Now, question C is a little bit different. If you notice, 2 is not a square, because when you take the square root of it, you get a decimal. And same thing with the 50. So in this case, we're going to actually have to use common factoring. So let's look at 2 and 50. The biggest number that can be divided by 2 and 50 is a 2. And now we draw the bracket and divide each of the terms by 2. Okay, 2x squared divided by 2 is x squared, and negative 50 divided by 2 is negative 25. Close the bracket. Now look carefully. Notice within the bracket, it's actually a difference of squares. So we are going to have to factor that out. Leave the 2 as it is, and to factor difference of squares, draw the two brackets, put a plus in one and a minus in the other, and let's take the square root. Square root of x squared is x, so we'll put that here and there. And square root of 25 is 5, so let's put that here and there as well. And that's our final answer. Now on to our next question. It's actually a difference of squares, so we are going to use the same method we've been using. So we're going to start off by drawing two brackets. Okay, put a plus in one and a minus in the other, and let's take the square root of each. Now, square root of y to the power of 4 is actually y to the power of 2, because square root of 4 is 2. Okay, now let's find the square root of 16, and that would be 4. So put a 4 here, and also 4 in the other bracket. Now, it might seem like we are done the question, but guess what? Notice this one we can factor even further by doing difference of squares. Now, because there's a difference there, a minus sign, we can do it. This one does not have a minus sign, so we cannot factor that one. Okay, so we're going to leave the y squared plus 4 as it is, because we cannot factor that further, but the other one, let's actually factor it. So to factor difference of squares, draw the two brackets, put a plus in one and a minus in the other, And let's do the square root of y squared, which is just y. And we'll put the y here as well. And then do square root of 4, which is 2 and 2. And this right here is our final answer. Now let's see if this is difference of squares. Well, the 16 is a square because you can square root it. And y minus 3 squared is actually a square as well. Well, because if I were to actually square root it, it would just be y minus 3 in brackets. So really, this is actually a square. Okay, now that we know that this is difference of squares, we're going to start off by drawing two brackets. And I'm going to draw square brackets just because there's going to be a lot of brackets here. Okay, so now let's put plus in one and minus in the other. And let's take the square root of 16, which is 4. So I'll put 4 in the first one and 4 in the second bracket. And now let's take the square root of y minus 3 squared, which is just y minus 3 in bracket and y minus 3 in bracket. Okay, now if you look inside, we can actually simplify the expressions within the brackets. But to do that, I need to get rid of the brackets that are inside the bracket. So I'll leave the 4 as it is. And notice there's a plus in front of the bracket here. So you can just get rid of the bracket and leave it as it is. Y minus 3 and close bracket. Now for the next one, leave the 4, but notice there's a negative in front of the bracket. That means all the signs in the inside of the bracket actually switch. So this y right now is a positive, but because there's a negative, you gotta switch it to a negative y. And this negative 3, you gotta switch the sign to a positive 3. Okay, now let's simplify within the brackets more. 4 and negative 3 are like terms, so let's do that. 4 minus 3 is 1, and then we leave the y as it is. Now let's do the next bracket. 4 plus 3 is 7, so we are going to write 7, and then the minus y, close bracket. And this is our final answer. Now let's focus on factoring a perfect square trinomial. Now let's do a recap. When you have x plus 4 bracket squared, that basically means you're multiplying x plus 4 by itself. So it looks something like this. And now when we multiply the binomials, we multiply those together and the 4 together, and that's how we would normally do it. But we talked about a shortcut. Now the shortcut is in the form of a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. Remember we did this a while ago? Now the x would be the a and the 4 would be the b. So what we would do is we would first square the a, so x would be x squared. And then, actually let's write that down. So x squared. And for the middle term, it should be 2 times a times b. So 2 times a, which is x, times b, which is 4. And when you multiply that all out, you should get 8x as your answer. So let's put that in here, positive 8x. And the last term would be b squared. So we would take the b, which is 4, and square that. And 4 squared is 16, so we will write positive 16. And that would be our final answer. Now today, you are going to get questions like this right here, and we are going to go backwards and put it all in a bracket by factoring it. So just a little reminder, when you are given a perfect square trinomial that looks like this with a positive, your final answer in the bracket will also have a positive. Now, if you're given a perfect square trinomial with a negative, your final factored answer will also have a negative inside the bracket. All right, now let's actually try some questions. Now for this question, the first thing we have to do is figure out, is this actually a perfect square? Okay, to do that, we first have to find the a and the b. Now the a, well, to figure that out, we're going to have to square root the first term, which is 2x. Now let's find b. For that, we would have to square the last term, and square root of 9 is 3. Okay, now we have that, so let's go on to check if this is actually in this format right here. Now let's look at the first term. It should be a square. Now is 4x squared a square? Yes, it is, because you can take the square root of it. Okay, so that checks out. Now let's move on to the middle term. It should be 2 times a times b. Okay, so 2 times a, well, a is 2x, so let's write that there, times b. Now b happens to be 3, so let's write that here. Now let's multiply this out. 2 times 2x times 3, well, that actually comes to 12x. Okay, so our middle term is actually 2ab. Now, our last term should also be a square. So is 9 a square? Yes, it is, because you can find the square root of it. So everything checks out. This means that our question is actually a perfect square. So to solve this, you draw a bracket. Now because the middle term had a minus sign, you have to put the minus sign here. And then you take the square root of the first term, which is 2x, and take the square root of the last term, which is 3. And then you put a little square right outside of the bracket. And this right here is our final answer. Now, same thing for this question. You're going to start out by seeing if it's a perfect square. So to do that, we have to figure out our a and b. So a over here would be basically the square root of the first term, which is 3x. And square root of b right here would be, well, square root of 1 is just 1. Okay, we have our a and b. So let's see if this is actually in this perfect square format. So let's start out with our first term. It should be a squared, meaning it should be a square. Now 9x squared is actually a square because you can take the square root of it. Okay, so that one checks out. Now let's move on to the middle term. The middle term should be 2 times a times b. Okay, so that's 2 times a, and a is 3x, so let's put that there. And b is 1, so let's put that here as well. And when you multiply them all together, you actually end up with 6x. So our middle term is actually 2ab. Now, our last term should be a square. Yep, because if you take the square root of 1, it's actually 1. 1 times 1 is 1. So all in all, this is actually a perfect square. So now to factor it, we are going to draw a bracket. And because the positive sign is there in the middle term, you have to write the positive sign. Now let's find the square root of 9x squared, which is 3x. And square root of 1 is just 1. And now you put a square right next to the bracket. And this is our final answer.